Enough is enough. Canadians are speaking. They want change. Don't be derelict in your responsibility to keep us safe. We want change now.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Northern Perspective. We have a repeat guest here who is always welcome on the show. He is a firecracker when it comes into committee. He was, what did Mr. Jennis call him, a up-and-coming rock star new MP last term, and he is back for his second term. He is known as Larry the Prosecutor. Witnesses fear him, conservatives love him. Mr. Brock, welcome back to Northern Perspective.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Tanya. It's always a pleasure to be back here talking to Canadians and giving them the straight goods.
Absolutely, because that's something that it is so hard to get these days through legacy media, through liberal talking points, through all of the misinformation, disinformation all over social media. It becomes very difficult to actually understand what is what. So one of the things that, let's just get right into it. One of the things that we were hoping that was going to be resolved in this election is the crime wave that has been going across Canada. And we see story after story, day after day, there are just multiple instances of criminals committing acts, and then we learn, not surprisingly, that they were out on bail. Mm-hmm. And we even had some situations in Hamilton where there were some tragedies as a result of criminals that were out on bail because they can't be put behind bars, and they seem to know it. So what's been your reaction to the non-action of this Liberal government, and what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm. You know, what you're presenting, I don't want to preach to the converted. We all have read, we've all experienced, we've all seen firsthand. In some cases, some of your listeners have probably been victimized themselves of what's been happening on our streets. It has been a wave, a consistent wave of criminality that has completely become a crisis across this country. I seen it firsthand when I was prosecuting in the trenches prior to my decision to leave the Ontario Public Service and run for office. I saw how communities were completely decimated by lawlessness. And I'm not talking about the totality of all the criminals that the criminal justice system processes every year. There are people who find themselves, and I think this is an important point to highlight, there are people who find themselves in life making wrong choices, making a wrong decision, sometimes literally being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and becoming charged, having police involvement, having criminal charges laid in relation to their involvement. But by and large, a vast majority of those individuals who go through the system do not repeat their criminal behavior because our system is designed to denounce, deter, and to rehabilitate. And for the vast majority of Canadians who find themselves in conflict with the law, it becomes a learning experience. So we're not talking about that class of individuals. We're talking about a small subsect, a very small percentage of repeat offenders. And these repeat offenders are not immune to certain geographical areas of our country. You can experience in a town of a couple of thousand individuals to our metropolitan areas in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. It is a small percentage of repeat offenders who are responsible for committing over 80% of all the crime in this country. Our system currently is not designed, as I've indicated, to deter, to denounce, and to rehabilitate. These individuals have become emboldened and have actually thanked the current liberal government for policies and laws that have allowed them to flourish in their chosen criminal enterprise. That is the class of individuals that are creating the chaos, the disorder, the fear, the uncertainty, the heightened expectations, the lack of privacy that we have as Canadians. They are terrorizing our streets. And this Liberal government, despite pleas from opposition members, pleas from people like myself, who I don't view myself as your typical politician. I've, enjoyed a 32-year career in the legal field. It's one thing for a politician to say we need reforms, we need change, but it's Canadians, it's premiers, it's law enforcement, it's victim groups, it's a whole litany of classes of individuals who are crying out for change. And inherent in those pleas, it's no small surprise that we have a lack of trust, a lack of confidence in the criminal justice system. And to me, I don't know if I shared this with the two of you or your listeners, but that was one of the motivating factors for me to leave the comfort of my old job, is because I was so disappointed in how our criminal justice system had deteriorated to the point where people would say to me, "What's it matter, Larry? Why do I have to report crime? Why do I have to proceed in this fashion? Why do I have to participate in the process when nothing is going to change? This person is going to get a slap on the wrist, maybe get a conditional sentence, start dealing drugs again from the comfort of his front porch. Why do I have to go through this process if nothing is going to change?" I can't disagree with that assessment. So to answer your question, this is a long-winded approach to answer your question, Ryan. It has been absolutely frustrating. I think I would get more results if I banged my head off your wall right now. At least I would see the impact of that decision than trying to get this government to move its needle on reform. Now, we all thought, and we're hearing this from our new Prime Minister, this is a new government. Same party, but new government, new approach. We're listening to Canadians. We want to address the issues, notwithstanding they stole most of the Conservative platform. And to a certain degree, I guess imitation is a form of flattery, steal. And I hope that Liberal insiders are watching this podcast and reviewing this podcast, because I want to speak to them as well. Steal my ideas, poach my ideas. Community safety, accountability, and responsibility ought not to be a partisan issue. And what I want to talk to you about today are simple, common sense solutions that will have an immediate impact on confidence and community safety.
Well, and the state of Canada as it is, it's so sad because we have people like Kate Alexander that have come on our show, who was beaten within an inch of her life.
Yes.
And the perpetrator, which was her boyfriend at the time, received a peace bond. That's all he received. And she was so afraid for her life that she literally moved out of the country, because she felt safer in the United States, that he couldn't get to her without being immediately arrested and thrown in jail, than being in Canada. It is just something else, and she has advocated, and she is a self-confessed former Liberal supporter. And she doesn't identify as a conservative. She just identifies as a voter that will vote for the party that makes the most sense. And she voted conservative in the last election. The amount of police unions and associations that threw their weight behind the Conservative Party in the last election should speak volumes, because I know they have been pleading and they have been sounding the alarm across the country. Yet the Liberal government would just look them in the face, the people who are actually on the ground, and say, oh, you're imagining this. This isn't what's happening. Our legislation is working.
Well, case in point, former Justice Minister Arif Virani, the very same day he was sworn in as the former Justice Minister, he said that to a reporter, that empirically he doesn't believe Canada has become less safe, and any concerns that Canadians have, literally, it's in their minds.
Well, and we have just a simple graph that we use often, and it is the violent crime rate in Canada. And we've divided it, we're going to have another section on it now, but we have divided it by government. And you can see it is very high when the Liberal Chrétien government was in. When the Harper government took over, it dropped significantly. And then as soon as the Justin Trudeau Liberal government took over and introduced Bill C48, it skyrocketed again.
Right.
And I think the previous stat was violent crime has increased by 40%. I think we're at 50% now.
We're over 50%.
So
gun crime, almost 120% increase since 2015.
And these are stats on the government website. These are not partisan talking points. These are not things that the Conservatives have created.
Canada.
Right.
Yeah.
So when the government's own website is reporting this, you have to ask these people, how in the heck can you stand there and say this is working? Is party pride, party ego, is it the inability to admit that they were wrong? Is that more important than the safety of Canadians?
Well, and I've said this till I can't. I've lost track how many times I've said this publicly in the House of Commons, that community safety, as I said, indicated, is not a partisan issue, but more importantly, the number one responsibility of the federal government is to keep Canadians safe. They telegraphed that in the throne speech recently. They're communicating that almost on a daily basis in question period and through our debates. But talk is cheap when there's no action. And we often criticize the Trudeau government, rightfully, that they get an A when they make announcements. They hit the right tone, they address the right concern, deliver the right message, but an F in follow-up. The same can be said so far over the last 4.5 weeks with this carny Liberal government. Again, talking, telegraphing what needs to be done, but what do we have? Do we have any legislation? Have they introduced any legislation where that we can examine it, we can debate it, we can challenge it, we can try to improve it? We've heard from Minister of Justice Fraser recently, a couple of days ago, in an interview, that he's expected to table a crime bill in the fall. But when you dig deep into the details of what he shared with reporters, nothing new other than what was actually telegraphed in the throne speech in terms of increasing penalties for certain classes of offenses and generally making it harder for individuals charged with that certain class of offenses to be ineligible for bail. Again, very short on detail, general promises. What I want Minister Fraser to consider is something that will impact every single criminal offense in the criminal code. And if you want to talk about that right now, Ryan and Tanya, I can. It's very simple. It's eliminating the principle of restraint.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. For Canadians that aren't familiar with this, because I was just going to ask, does he address the principle of least restraint? So for Canadians that are not familiar with this, give us the Coles Notes of what that is.
Got you. So to answer your question, Minister Fraser, in his announcement a few days ago, and I don't know when people are going to be watching this, but this would have been the last week of June, he telegraphed to Canadians that he was going to table legislation in the fall to address a number of offenses, but he made no reference to addressing the issue of bail generally and the principle of restraint. So this is a Coles Notes version, a very simplified version of this.
And this is in the law, folks.
Exactly. Prior to 2018, so roughly 7.5 years ago, what existed in the criminal justice system in bail courts right across this country was an approach that allowed the justice, whether that be the judge, Ontario or a provincial court judge, or a judge, justice of the peace, to allow them to make a decision based on all the evidence that was put forth by the Crown and challenged by defense counsel, where they made an assessment based on the strength or the weaknesses of the Crown's case and the proposed plan of release, whether it was an acceptable risk. That was the mantra of every bail decision that was happening prior to 2018. It was a solid approach because the whole concept of a bail application is an assessment of risk. Can communities, can the victim be safe if the state released the accused on conditions? Or is the risk so high that the individual needs to be detained for the protection of the victim and the protection of the community? It was a balanced assessment, and it was very effective. There was far more people being released, and appropriately so, but the class of individuals that I spoke about, those repeat violent offenders who kept making promise after promise after promise not to misbehave while on release, the judges were saying, you gave me a promise, you broke that promise, these are the consequences. You're going to remain in custody until you decide you want a trial or you're going to plead guilty. And statistics have shown very effectively that those repeat criminals, once they are detained, criminality in those communities drop. It's a direct link. That's what existed prior to 2018. Justin Trudeau, as you mentioned, through Bill C48, introduced a whole suite of changes and amendments and reforms to criminal justice, but a portion of Bill 75 addressed bail. And what Justin Trudeau did, with the support of his entire Liberal government and backbench MPs, introduced and amended the criminal code to include section 493.1, which is entitled the principle of restraint. And I'm paraphrasing right now, this is not the exact language, but since 2018, that balanced approach I mentioned was completely turned over on its head. 493.1 now tells judges they must release the accused at the earliest opportunity on the least restrictive conditions. So forget about that balanced assessment. Regardless of the offender, regardless of the offense they committed, regardless of the number of times they've committed that similar offense, regardless of how many releases that individual is on, regardless of the carnage that crime has created to the community or to the victim, regardless of that person's criminal record, which shows a pattern of disobeying court orders and committing the same offense over and over again, that person must be released.
So they're releasing murderers?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Okay, that is the restraint principle. That needs to be eliminated. It needs to be struck from the criminal code. I have spoken with retired justices. I have spoken with sitting justices, and they both, all of them, unanimously have agreed that that removed their ability to provide that balancing assessment of all the factors that go into a decision to detain or release an accused. They literally felt themselves handcuffed by the federal government in its approach on how to deal with bail. I mentioned this in a private meeting with Minister Fraser. When I first found out he was the Justice Minister, he found out I was the Shadow Minister for Justice and the Attorney General. I was very frank with him as to what needed to be done. I encouraged him to steal my ideas, introduce legislation immediately to get back to that balanced approach, to give the tools back to our justices so that they have the ability to keep communities safe. As I said, I think it just went in one ear and out the other. Never got the impression that this is something that the Liberal government is prepared to move on. It is a simple fix, which then brings me to a discussion, whether we want to have it now, Ryan or Tanya, or later in this podcast. But I believe in the power of many, many voices singing from the same prayer book when it comes to advocacy. 3 years we have had every single prominent group and individual cry out for real bail reform. We're talking premiers, we're talking police chiefs, we're talking presidents of police associations, we're talking about provincial politicians, we're talking about every opposition member currently in the House of Commons, we're talking about victims groups and constitutional minded groups that are out there, that we need a more balanced approach when it comes to bail reform. And what did the government do? Well, they called in a one-day summit. Do you remember a few years ago when we had so many police officers suffering injuries from gun-related crimes, and unfortunately and sadly, tragically, number of officers being shot by repeat violent criminals? The government's response: let's have a one-day summit. Let's bring in all the important stakeholders and have them repeat what they've been saying to the federal government for a number of years. And from that one-day summit, they promised all of those individuals, the premiers, law enforcement, victims groups, they promised to introduce bail reform to ensure that communities would be kept safe. They produced Bill C48. Bill C48 was their flagship piece of legislation that Justice Varani, the Minister of Justice, proudly exclaimed a number of times in and outside the House of Commons that this would give the justices the tools to keep repeat offenders who are committing the offenses involving serious gun crimes back off our streets and into custody. Didn't move the needle at all, sad to say. C48 did not remove the principle of restraint. All it did, and I'm getting into the weeds here and I don't want to, but those who have a legal background will understand this, C48 just reversed the onus for individuals charged with certain firearms offenses, that instead of the Crown proving to the court that a person should be detained, it now became the responsibility of the accused and their lawyer to prove why they should be released. It doesn't matter to a judge who's responsible for what when you still have the principle of restraint hanging over their heads and the federal government telegraphing to them, you must release.
Well, and the mind-boggling part about this whole thing is the easy fix is to literally just repeal and reverse everything they did in C75 when it comes to principle of least restraint. To me,
Correct.
that's all they need to do.
Correct.
So this is not rocket science.
Right. So that is why I said the power of collective voices. We need to get this to the attention of the federal government as effectively as possible. Repeating the same type of advocacy clearly is not working because they're not listening. I have put together a petition. It's simply titled Bail Reform. It speaks to the concept of what's happening in our community and what needs to be done by removing the principle of restraint. I'm going to be going on a speaking tour across this country for most of the summer. I'm going to be talking to as many podcasters as possible that are community, not necessarily conservative minded, but simply community safety minded. And I need our voices to be strongly reflected in this petition. My goal is 1 million Canadians plus signing this petition, telegraphing to the federal government, enough is enough. Canadians are speaking. They want change. Don't be derelict in your responsibility to keep us safe. We want change now. And that's what I'm going to be launching as of beginning of July, depending on when you're seeing this podcast. And I am hoping that we can generate enough buzz, enough excitement that we can proudly come in with banker box after banker box of individuals who have signed this petition to say, here, Prime Minister Carney, here, Justice Minister Sean Fraser, this is what Canadians want. Now it's time for you to deliver.
Well, and people sometimes say, well, what's the point of a petition? They never work. I disagree with that because Canadians managed to get the carbon tax removed without a law, without a petition. They voted with their comments, they voted in the polls, and they let the Liberal government know that they were not having it. There was so much pressure from Canadians on even the premiers, on the MPs, that Justin Trudeau was forced to remove it from the Eastern Canada provinces earlier in his tenure. And Carney was forced to remove it, literally on his first day as Prime Minister, to pander to the over 75% of Canadians that did not want the carbon tax. So community voices can be effective. So for anyone that is listening to this, this is not a partisan issue. This is a safety issue. This is a Canadian issue. We want to be able to feel safe, not having locked our doors while we're in the house, never mind leaving the house. We want to feel safe walking down the street.
We want to know our car's going to be there in the morning when we get up.
Precisely.
So this is so important, and it's such an easy thing, and it's a low risk type of approach because we know it works. Because this is the way the law was under Stephen Harper.
Right.
And from my research, the main reason the Liberals did this is because they thought certain demographics were overrepresented in the justice system. That's why they put this in. Well, now we see the effects of not having that same safeguard in place when it comes to sentencing and when it comes to evaluating whether or not criminals should be put out on bail. So I encourage all Canadians to, when you see this, sign it, share it, and talk about it. Doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right or the center or this way to Sunday. It doesn't matter. When it comes to safety and the crime rate across Canada, this is something that is not a partisan issue.
And we'll be sharing this petition on all of our socials as soon as it becomes available, so please keep your eyes out for it.
So thank you, Mr. Brock, for spearheading that. It's probably one of the most important messages in Canada that's non-monetary of our day.
Correct.
because of the level of increase, like 40-50%, over 50% increase in violent crime. That's an epidemic.
Yes.
And Canadians across this country, they're paying the price.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe some future podcast, you can invite me right back where we are right now, and I can talk about some of the other legislative reforms that I have spoken to Minister Fraser about, and hopefully we can expand upon that and take a look at, again, the whole concept of rebuilding confidence and trust for Canadians in our justice system. You know, I've spoken to so many victims, they don't even call it a justice system anymore. They view it as a legal system because they have felt left out for far too long. These are a number of easy fixes, a number of amendments I want to make, want to bring. And on the petition end of things, as strong as that message is, we are also prepared, a number of members are prepared to introduce private member bills, both in the House of Commons and in the Senate. Again, all telegraphing to the federal government what needs to be done to restore that balance and trust again in our criminal justice system, to hold offenders accountable, but also to rehabilitate in the process.
Now let's talk about one other aspect of the justice system that is lacking. The Conservatives have spoken about it. We've seen journalists speak about it, and it's with regard to the drug trafficking that is coming into this country. We've interviewed Sam Cooper on a number of occasions. He's talked about the issues of what is coming in from East Asia and China into Vancouver. That is essentially the distribution point down to the United States and throughout Eastern Canada. And there's another reporter, Katarina Schultz, who has done a lot of work on the Mexican cartels and talked about the fact that because the U.S. has been so aggressive in labeling those cartels as terrorist organizations and how they deal with them, all they've done is essentially relocated their business up to Canada.
Yes.
And probably non-coincidentally, out to Vancouver. So, and one of the main reasons is because you have our CBSA, our Canada Border Services Agency, they don't have the tools, they don't have the personnel, and less than 1% of all shipping containers coming in are actually scanned. So, like if you're playing the lottery as one of these evil doers, you're saying, well, I have a 99% chance that my stuff is not going to be picked up.
You're going to play the odds.
Right. Why would you not?
10 ways to Sunday, you'll play those odds.
So what do we need to do to address that? And one of Carney's latest bills that we have immense problems with, Bill C2, and that's called the Strong Borders Act. Does that have a chance of addressing any of this at all in a way that doesn't violate our charter rights?
Sure. And I'm not going to get in, because that's a podcast in and of itself, where you're taking a look at the potential charter challenges. But some of the areas in C2 should, I say should, not would, should address some of the issues that you've raised. C2 talks about hiring more personnel for the border, a move that we've been asking for and advocating for a number of years. So that's a good thing. Providing them with technology, up-to-date scanning technology, to allow them to intercept either stolen goods leaving or contraband coming into our country, a good thing. Changing the jurisdictional responsibility, giving CBSA agents responsibility, legal responsibility to intercept containers leaving our ports. I didn't realize, maybe you didn't as well, that largely CBSA has the jurisdiction for imports, not exports. Yeah. Very odd. Very odd.
We don't care about what's leaving the country. That's somebody else's problem?
I guess not. And that therein lied all the problems, all the stories we heard about, individuals who had their expensive vehicles stolen with GPS devices, and they were able to track their stolen vehicle to a particular container and had local police enforcement at the ready to assist them in retrieving their item. But again, because of procedural issues between CBSA's responsibility and local law enforcement's responsibility on a jurisdictional basis, no one had the authority to do anything. So simple fixes to obvious problems, C2 is going to address. I don't know effectively when this is going to take place. Should happen as soon as possible once the bill passes. But that again is an issue as to whether or not the Liberal government is prepared to move that swiftly. So that's one aspect. The second aspect regarding the fentanyl, I didn't know that it was so easy for anyone, any Canadian for that matter, to order the fentanyl precursors, the ingredients from China directly without establishing that you have a legitimate lawful purpose for acquiring these precursors. An obvious fix was to regulate the precursors, and C2 has done that. To make it an offense unless you can establish lawful possession and lawful acquisition of the precursors, it becomes an offense under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So those are two good features of C2. Again, the issue becomes how swiftly it will be implemented. That's a mystery. But the bigger question, and I think this is apropos to your question, Ryan, in terms of sending the appropriate message to the Mexican cartel. Let's face it, Canada is open for criminality, and the world knows that.
Yeah.
The cartels know that. You've addressed the issue regarding the Vancouver port, one of the worst ports in the entire world, in my view, in terms of how much illegal activity is actually taking place. You mentioned, and it's correct, that less than 1% of the containers are actually inspected. But I went out to Vancouver in February. Glenn Motz, MP and Glenn Motz and I were on a Stop the Crime Canada-wide tour. And I was talking to Vancouver Marine Police. And they shared with me that the criminals are getting so sophisticated. They're always a couple of steps ahead of law enforcement. They know that there is a very good chance they can get their contraband out on the containers. But in the event that technology is now available to CBSA, they're actually attaching their contraband underwater, attached to the ship itself. And apparently Vancouver Marine Police Services have a dedicated team, but it's expensive, it's time consuming,
Dangerous.
dangerous, and with the number of ships that are coming into that port, they're merely scratching the surface. Yes, the ones they do examine, they're catching and they're removing the contraband. We're talking drugs, we're talking precursors, we're talking weapons, a myriad of contraband goods entering our country. That's how fast criminals are just trying to stay ahead of law enforcement and politicians. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done to really secure our borders. C2 is a start, but it's not going to be the end solution. But we had to start somewhere.
Well, and as we mentioned, there's a portion or a few portions of C2 that are extremely concerning
Yes.
to Canadians. So
Yes.
if they ripped those concerning parts out, I think we're getting
And
close.
we'll study that in committee.
Yep.
It will be going to committee,
I think we're getting closer to a common sense portion of it.
particularly the issue of mail, interception of mail and opening that up, right?
And warrantless information requests to
Correct.
ISPs.
Yes. Yeah.
And it goes on.
Yeah.
It goes on.
But I didn't finish my thoughts. We have to send a message worldwide, okay, that Canada is going to get tough when it comes to shutting down its fentanyl playground, I like to call it, here in Canada. Like the stories out of BC are just astonishing. That super lab in Falkland that the RCMP took down resulted in one arrest. One custodial individual has been arrested. But there was enough precursor material to essentially make 96 million doses of fentanyl. And I've used this story as part of my tour because, let's face it, that would be enough to kill every Canadian twice over.
Yeah.
So we know it's not for domestic consumption. It is for external uses. And it's going back to the United States, it's going back to Mexico, it's going into Asia, it's going into Europe, again, leaving our Vancouver ports largely unchecked. And so my point, though, we have to send the message. We can't send a message if we're not tough on trafficking, if we're not tough on importing and exporting and making fentanyl. C5 gutted the effectiveness of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It removed every mandatory minimum penalty that existed. And again, I'm going to get deep into the weeds. I don't want to do that. But this is a real problem when it comes to an effective deterrent. Yes, judges, by and large, will still send large-scale traffickers to prison for a long period of time. But let's face it, the reality is we've got a lot of activist judges who are currently on our bench right across this country. So despite what the Liberal government will often say that there's uniformity when it comes to decision making by our judiciary, the sad reality is, and the fact is, it is not uniform. So the fact that you have removed a mandatory minimum penalty opens up the possibility, as shocking as this is going to sound to the two of you and to your listeners, opens up the possibility that someone who has purchased the precursors from China, created their own little lab in the comfort of their parents' basement, then are becoming the wholesaler, distributor, and selling it on the street, literally can get punished, if caught, to a house arrest conditional sentence.
To
Instead
just
of
continue
going
doing what they're doing.
in the comfort of their own home, Ryan.
Gosh.
In the comfort of their own. That's how crazy C5 is. And it's happening. You are hearing, you are reading stories every day about traffickers of fentanyl, crystal meth, who are avoiding jail terms and are getting house arrest sentences.
Well, and these people are potentially mass murderers.
They are mass murderers. Our party recognized the fact that they are mass murderers. That's why our election platform talked about making it a mandatory life imprisonment for traffickers of a certain quantity of fentanyl. Common sense. They are merchants. I'm using this phrase not because I thought of it, although it's a really good phrase. It's because I read a decision out of Alberta where a particular judge had the courage to speak very strongly against the scourge of trafficking of fentanyl in this country and equated those traffickers as merchants of death.
So I just want to clarify for our viewers, and this is the confusing part about our parliament sometimes. When you're talking C5, you're talking the C5 under Justin Trudeau in the 44th Parliament, not the recent C5 in the 45th, correct?
Absolutely correct. Yes, there is a distinction because every parliament, we basically start from number one all the way. So when you are talking about certain bills, you always have to preface that with which particular parliament or which particular prime minister it was introduced under. So thank you for clarifying that, Ryan.
So there's a lot of work to do. there's a lot of Canadians that don't have the confidence in the current Justice Minister who destroyed our immigration system, then went on to obliterate our housing system, and now he's in charge of our justice system. But
Yes.
we can hold out an outside hope, I guess, that he will, third time's the charm, I guess. I don't know. But we will watch with great interest and anticipation for the petition once that's launched. And we need common sense back into our criminal justice system. Like we cannot wait anymore as Canadians.
As I indicated, these are easy, simple fixes that ought not to be partisan laden. They're all common sense. They're all designed to give tools back to justices, all with the express purpose of ensuring community safety and protection of victims. So the people like Kate Alexander that you referenced, I know her very well. We have spoken about this particular petition. She's on board with it. She proudly represents the EVE organization, and they are hoping for a number of changes, particularly in relation to intimate domestic violence. And there are so many things, as I indicated throughout this interview, so many things that I want to do in terms of having discussions with Minister Fraser, but more importantly, taking a very proactive role in introducing as many private member bills to ensure that we are protecting Canadians and that we are holding offenders accountable so that they can be rehabilitated and get back to a sense that there is that justice system back in our criminal legal system that some victims will often refer to. We have to establish the confidence and the trust. That is my number one goal.
And you had mentioned that you're going on a cross-country tour this
Yes.
summer. For Canadians who want to come out and listen to you speak or meet you, how can they find out where you're going to be?
Great idea. I will give you my itinerary, Tanya, once it's been formalized, and perhaps you can share Larry's going to be in this particular province, in this particular city, from this day to that day, and we can connect, make those connections through that means. I want to meet as many Canadians as possible who are as passionate as we are in terms of advocating for change, and looking forward to that process.
Will that be also posted on your Facebook and your social media?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
So make sure you follow Larry Brock on Facebook, on X, and his other socials. In addition to the information we'll provide, you should be able to get a sense of when he's going to be and hear him speak. And if you have not heard him speak in person, you're in for a treat if you can make it out. Mr. Brock, thanks for coming on Northern Perspective, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you, and thank you for what you do.